Good evening and welcome to this week's Hamilton Report. Today is the 10th day of May, 2021. As you know, I was not with you last week because the Edmond Democratic Women's Association held a candidate forum for all three of the candidates running for chair this coming June. It was a great evening. I think everyone that watched it learned a great deal, and it's still available on their Facebook page. I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's very informative, and I think that you will find that it's time well spent. So that's where I was last Monday evening. I'm delighted, though, to be back with you this evening. I always appreciate the time that we have to spend together. I should say at the outset that tonight's broadcast is going to be somewhat different than my usual broadcast, primarily because I have no guest to join me. You see, I spent all weekend trying to put pen to paper to express what it was I was feeling after I got news late on Friday afternoon that Governor Stitt had signed into law HB 1775, which prohibits the teaching of cultural diversity and critical race theory. I'll talk more about that in a minute, and the impact that it will have on our state, our children, our economy, and the future of Oklahoma. But I was driving back from Tulsa on Friday. It was late afternoon, and frankly, I was hopeful that enough people had called the governor's office to persuade him to better judgment on this issue. Thousands of Oklahomans did call the governor's office and voice their concern about this legislation. And yet he went ahead and decided to sign this bill late on a Friday afternoon, hoping, I suppose, that he would somehow get lost in the evening shuffle and wouldn't make it onto the news, that it would simply die over the weekend. And nothing could be further from the truth. Within 2 minutes of the news that he had signed this, the phone started ringing at the Oklahoma Democratic Party, and Alicia Andrews began doing interviews on behalf of the party. Now, just 3 days later, we have made headlines all across this country, from Washington State to Washington, D.C., Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Connecticut, New York, Chicago. Beyond the United States borders, though, we have also made headlines in British Columbia, in Ontario, in Calgary, even in India and Taiwan. Well, this is a weekend when there were 9+ mass shootings in the United States. So why all of the interest in this little piece of legislation coming out of Oklahoma? I'll tell you, because people found it positively unbelievable. And those that did believe it almost certainly laughed at the notion, making Oklahoma again the laughing stock, not just of this country, but of the world. And why? Because we're afraid to teach children in public education about the truth of our nation. We want to talk about history, but we want to do it in little bits and pieces, the things that we want to sanitize and make clean and make everyone feel comfortable about. Well, that's not what education is, and it's most certainly not what history is. You remember on the 6th day of January, when the Capitol was under siege, what did you see marching through the halls, the sacred halls of our nation's capital? The Confederate flag. These are folks who somehow are still remembering in a very positive fashion a Confederacy who lost a war. Now, with this new legislation, we'll still be able to talk about the Civil War, and I'm most certain that many Southern states will probably still require school children to memorize speeches of Ulysses S. Grant? Not hardly. More like Robert E. Lee. You see, there's a historic kind of nostalgia that people want to ascribe to slavery. And I can assure you that for most Americans, there is no nostalgia, there is shame. But see, it's the shame that makes us uncomfortable, and yet that's how we learn. I want to take a little history trip back to before the days of the founding of this nation. Now, there's something called the Negro Act of 1740. This act was for the better control of Negroes and other enslaved persons, according to the way it read. It was passed and gave full authority to anyone to whip, beat, or kill a Black person who they thought was stepping out of line. It made it illegal for them to earn money, to learn to read, to grow food for themselves or their families. Talk about marginalization. But those are the principles on which our country was founded. I want to read to you something that Stitt said just as he tried to defend his passing of this legislation. He says, "We cannot revert to 100-year-old thinking that a person is any less valuable or inherently racist by the color of their skin." Martin Luther King spoke. Now, how unconscionable is it that this man would invoke Dr. King's name? But he says, Martin Luther King spoke of a day when people in America will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. House Bill 1775 codifies that concept so that many of us believe in our hearts, including me, and as governor, I will not stand for publicly funded K through 12 schools training impressionable minds to define themselves by their sex or their race. What did you just hear in all that? A bunch of words is what it is. Maybe it was to assuage a guilty conscience. Why else would he invoke Dr. King's name into this horrific conversation? It does not codify anything like he says it does. But what it does is it strips our school children from the ability to learn the truth about what happened. Now, as far back as I have been able to tell on both sides of my family, no one ever enslaved a person. But I can't tell you that that's true. It's just as far back as I can go, which isn't very far. But the bottom line is my relatives lived in a time when the relatives of many of you were forced into labor for no wages, for nothing positive in their lives except the hope of eventual death. You see, what I'm saying is not one of us is excused when it comes to slavery. Why is it that we are so afraid to talk about this thing? We're so afraid of hurting little children, that they might be scarred forever to learn that their ancestors took human beings into bondage, treated them worse than pack animals, and made them suffer even unto death. This isn't about protecting children. It's protecting the fragile egos of politicians who are much more concerned about what they think they are, the people that they are representing want. Well, I can tell you one thing that I'm really, really tired of. I'm tired of people in our legislature proclaiming to be Christians, cloaking everything they say in their Christianity, quoting Bible scriptures to justify their actions or their inactions, and then behaving in a way that further marginalizes people. As a person of faith, I find that absolutely disgusting. That you would use your religion, that you would make it a marketing tool for your evil, for your racism, for your bigotry. What I read a moment ago from South Carolina, I want to move forward now to 1865. That's when the 13th Amendment passed. And at that time, one would think that things were looking better for African Americans, except the fact that all it did was cause black codes and Jim Crow laws. Many of the efforts that we've seen around the country this year to make it more difficult to vote, particularly for people of color and other marginalized communities, are nothing more than Jim Crow 2021. But let's continue on our journey of things that we will not be able to talk about. Jim Crow laws? No, because that would make white people uncomfortable. It would make them seem mean in some way, so we can't teach that to our children. Brown versus the Board of Education was decided in 1954. Separate but equal was no longer good enough. Now that's 1954. Moving forward from that time, how long do you suppose it took for the Oklahoma City public schools to be integrated? From 1954 to 1972, with the implementation of a very sprawling plan called the Finger Plan that integrated Oklahoma City schools. Now, I can tell you that going to an integrated school was one of the best things that happened to me as a public school student. It allowed me to broaden my horizon, my thinking, to actually think more critically about who I am and who my new friends were. But that's a long time between 1954 and 1972. And even then, people were horrified. But you see, it was easier for me because I didn't have to be bused across town. I stayed in the schools that were closest to my home. I didn't have to spend an extra hour traveling to school and home from school every day, the same way some of my friends did. And the white flight, oh my, the hundreds of thousands of school children that left Oklahoma City because their parents were afraid to send them to school with black children. We won't be able to teach that anymore, according to this new legislation. Let's go take a step back now to 1964. Loving versus Virginia. That's in my lifetime that it was illegal in 14 states, even then, including the state of Oklahoma, for a white man or a black woman to be married, for any two races to be married. Loving versus Virginia decided that that was an unconstitutional ban, and therefore integrated marriage became legal throughout the United States. Will we be able to talk about that in detail as to why that law even existed in the first place? No, we won't. We'll whitewash that out as well. It wasn't until 2015 that marriage equality was decided throughout this country. That means that two same gender loving people could actually enjoy all of the financial benefits that were afforded to straight couples since the beginning of this country's foundation. That was 2015. Will we be able to talk about that? Well, certainly not, because you see, this law also talks about gender, and we can't deal with gender issues, and therefore we can't deal with sexuality issues either. Will we be able to talk in the future in Oklahoma schools about things like Stonewall and the impact that that has had on people around the world? The beginning of a new dawn of equality that had never been thought possible except by a very few. Does that all go away? Sadly, It does. I was 50 years old when I learned about the Tulsa race riots, except even then, that information wasn't full and complete because it wasn't a riot, it was a massacre. And I learned it through reading a New York newspaper. Nothing I'd ever been taught in Oklahoma City schools. You see, my one semester of Oklahoma history was taught by the tennis coach. And basically, from that, I remember the land run, and that Oklahoma means literally home of the red man or land of the red man. So there we have it. That's Oklahoma history in a nutshell. Oh, and let's not forget that Guthrie was intended to be the state capital. I didn't learn much about Oklahoma history, but I can thankfully say that through my high school and college years, I was able to learn a lot more about American history. The good, the bad, the frustrating parts, the things that we can be proud of. Oh, yes, I learned about the Industrial Revolution and learned about the building of the Capitol in Washington and all of the great things that happened. But I even then didn't learn that Washington, D.C. was built by black hands doing construction to create monuments to people that even today are revered. So all of this becomes homogenized, and we no longer have the ability to teach our children right from wrong when it comes to history. We don't get to make judgments, and we, worse, don't encourage them to think critically. Sadly, this is not a K through 12 issue. It continues on to the college university level. That means you cannot require a student to take a diversity training course, a cultural diversity course. You can't teach a group of students, unless they ask for it, to be made aware of the challenges faced by Japanese Americans in this country who are in internment camps. Won't be able to talk, I suppose, about all of the anti-Asian violence that's occurred just in the last 5 years. Worse than even that. At OU, the OU Med School requires one class, not a semester, but literally a one lecture period class on sexual diversity. It's not a lot, but it's something, and I'm proud to have taken part in a number of those trainings to young medical students. That won't be possible anymore. What about a social worker? Would you want to entrust your mental health to someone who had been denied taking courses in sexual diversity, gender diversity, women's issues? Yeah, even those will not be allowed in the state of Oklahoma. One of the things that I've been really proud of is that in the time that I have lived in Oklahoma, I have been able to participate in many, many diversity trainings for state offices. The Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, corrections, juvenile affairs. The list is very long. And I've always been pleased with those because I felt like I was bringing something to many of these folks that they otherwise would not have heard. And sometimes some people would come up to me after the session and want to tell me about their son or daughter being bullied, or they wanted to talk about their mother and their mother's girlfriend. Yes, see, that's not legal in Oklahoma anymore on state property. So that goes away. Friends, we cannot afford to wipe out our history, not if we have any shot of moving forward as a state. All I've talked about to this point is simply education. But let's take that one step further. If you were a business person considering relocating your family to Oklahoma, is this a place where you would want your children educated, where they got only a smiling snapshot of history? Not me. And what if you were thinking about opening a small business or bringing your business to Oklahoma? Would you subject your employees to an environment where people had never been taught to think about diversity, about inclusion, real inclusion? I wouldn't. So what Stitt has effectively done by signing this legislation, along with so many other pieces of foolery this year, is he has put a one-way door on the state of Oklahoma. A young person who wants to grow and to learn and to think on their own will leave through that door. But the door only swings one way. You see, no one's going to want to come to Oklahoma, not when we have this backwards thinking. He says he doesn't want to revert to a 100-year-old thinking. Well, let me tell you, Governor, your thinking is worse than 100 years old. It goes back to the founding of this country. I hope I don't have to tell you that the founding of this country was not just a bunch of people who got on some boats and came to America for a better life. It was done on the backs of people taken against their will. Of course, we can't talk about that anymore in Oklahoma. As far as Oklahoma City, we talk about being a big league city. Oklahoma City, you cannot be a big league city in a backwards thinking state. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't happen, and it certainly won't happen now. I'm tired. I'm tired of this foolishness, pardon me. I'm tired of the way Republicans continue to radicalize themselves and do things that are so bad for our children, for our educational system, for our economy, and yes, even our society. We have to wake up, Oklahoma. We have to wake up now and say no more. We are not going to take the lies cloaked in the Bible. If you believe in the truth, then you believe in the whole truth. And if you don't believe in the whole truth, then stop calling yourself a Christian. As far as I'm concerned, you can stop calling yourself an Oklahoman. What is the Oklahoma standard? We hear so much about it. People pitching in to help other people. Yeah, guess what? People in Vermont do that too. People in Oregon and Texas and Wyoming and Illinois. We're not unique in that regard. People want to help other people. That's how we get to know each other. But if we're afraid to know each other because we don't know the truth, where is that Oklahoma standard now? I'm sorry to be so one-dimensional on this issue tonight, but I hope you can tell that I am passionate about positive change in Oklahoma. Positive change. We are not going to grow economically. We're not going to grow intellectually. And we cannot entice people to want to come and be a part of this state if we continue to have these kind of shenanigans, foolishness, or as our chair often says, performative legislation. That's all it is. It's a performance. Oklahoma and now Idaho have signed this into law. Other states will follow. And I'll tell you something. A group of Congress people have already written to the Secretary of Education demanding that critical race theory not be taught. It's interesting to see where some of these people went to school and what they were taught. Senator Cruz was his whole kindergarten through 12th grade education was in a private Baptist school. And I'm guessing that he probably didn't learn a whole lot of true American history there. Some of the others that railed along with him from southern states, where Louisiana, for one, the textbook showed as late as the 1980s that enslaved people in Louisiana were some of the happiest people of all because they were so well treated. Oh, I've read the stories in some of those textbooks about how the slaves were so in love with their masters that they even took the silverware and jewelry and tucked it underneath their own beds at night to make sure it was safe from the Union Army. Come on. That's fantasy land, and I'm not having it. I don't live in a fantasy, and you don't either. We are working Oklahomans trying just to keep one foot in front of another, trying to make things a little bit better for our children, our grandchildren, and generations to come. And the only way we can do that is with one loud, resounding voice say, get out. Not Oklahomans, but Republican legislators who are so bent on keeping this state backwards, moving us in a direction that nobody wants to go. I'm done. I'm done with this discussion for tonight. And I appreciate you indulging me because it's something that I'm not going to quit talking about. It's going to be on my mind and on my social media and in my writing and in my discussing until it's found to be unconstitutional. That's my hope. I hope that other people, other places are smarter than our legislators and certainly smarter than Stitt, who will be able to see the truth and call it what it is. The only way for us to make a difference is to work together, to get involved right now with your state party at the county level, at the congressional district level, at the state level. You can volunteer. There are no big elections coming up. I understand that. But we need volunteers to register people to vote. We need volunteers to learn, to take advantage of training opportunities so that they can move into a position of helping a candidate next year. Next year's a big year, but this year is an even bigger one because we have a lot of foundational work to do. And I know we can do it together. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me tonight. Believe me, I'm not talking down to you. Probably echoing much of what you've been thinking about as well. And if that's the case, reach out, get involved. We can do better. And the Oklahoma standard that people are so quick to flaunt, I say it's time for you and me and our families and our friends to rewrite that standard, but make it a lot higher standard than it's ever been before. Thank you for spending half an hour with me tonight. You have no idea how much I appreciate you letting me into your homes and into your lives. I hope that if you found value in this broadcast, that you will please share it with your friends on Facebook, share the YouTube link, because the more people that know what's really happening to them can take action for themselves. Until we're together again next Monday night, I ask that you please take good care of yourself. There's a lot of work to do, and we need everyone healthy to be able to work together. I'm honored to be working for you as the executive director of your Oklahoma Democratic Party. Until next week, Good night.